recording. You probably get a notification that says we're recording.
Yes, it just popped up on the screen.
All right, good. I just for legal purposes, I don't want you to sue me. And your lipstick is on. All right, so
Yeah.
we're gonna start officially right now.
Sounds good.
All right. Hello and welcome again to the Other Underground Railroad. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Nichols, and I'm here with a very special guest. And I became aware of her and her book, which I had next to me. Here it is, right? It is an excellent book. I became aware of it at the university. Well, I won't say which university, but you all know. I became aware of it. I read the book. It's amazing, and it's amazing that she's coming here to join us. Dr. Tanya Hernandez. How are you doing, Tanya?
I'm fine, thank you.
So tell us a little bit about your book and how you came to actually, undertaking this project.
Okay, well, I got interested in researching questions about multiracial identity in anti-discrimination law cases when I started to read in some newspapers and journals and even some scholarly accounts the claim that the discrimination that multiracial people or biracial people experience, that it was somehow something different than people who only identify with one race experience. And I found that a bit surprising, that idea, because while everybody's personal identity is, obviously unique to them and what have you, my own background is sort of being multiracial myself and living within a Latino culture that always celebrates racial mixture. That exposure, to me, had always been one that showed that when discrimination happens, it doesn't happen in a more interesting or fluid or nuanced manner. That when discrimination happens, it happens in a very crude and binary way. Meaning, you you catch hell because some person wants to deny you a public good because of what they perceive is problematic about your race. So that got me curious, sort of like, why was my experience of what it means to be mixed race and experience discrimination so different from what I was hearing in these news accounts?
So with you and your personal identity, you go through it in the introduction to the book. It's fascinating, very interesting, with you being, like you said, a mixed race person, but also being Latina. Do you think in the legal system and, in the criminal justice system that you are perceived as a racially mixed person? Or do you think, the fact that you are Latina would complicate that and you would be grouped in with other Latinas regardless of skin color?
Well, what's interesting is that when I looked at the criminal justice system as well to see sort of, when people who are caught up in the criminal justice system say that they've experienced this racial discrimination in it, does that look different if they say that their racial identity is multiracial? And what I found was that while how you look can be can vary depending on how dark your skin tone is and what your phenotype is, right? That multiracial identity itself doesn't necessarily moderate that. Meaning,
Right.
Racial mixture can look all kinds of ways.
Right,
So
absolutely.
to say you identify as multiracial, well, that may be all well and good, but how you are perceived is a different thing. And the discrimination sort of cycles around how others perceive you. So if they group you as being in a racial group that they find problematic, you will catch hell for that. And it doesn't matter what your own personal identity is. That's what I found over and over again.
I see. So in other words, if I am, blonde-haired and blue-eyed, but I identify as half Asian, you're going to see me as a blonde-haired and blue-eyed guy, and I'm going to have the advantages based on that. But if I look like Dr. Jason Nichols and, he looks like a black guy, but I identify as half Indian or something, I'm going to be grouped in with black people because that's how I'm perceived.
Exactly. And so to just kind of add a little bit more texture as far as like how I saw it show up in the criminal justice system, what I found quite fascinating was the number of cases of people who are incarcerated, men actually, mostly men who are incarcerated who identify as mixed race, but were upset when prison officials would group them in the segregated prison setting in sectors that were predominantly white, right? So like the white part of the jail,
Right.
because what they say, and they had plenty of bruises to just to back up their claims. They claimed that when they were put in with white people, it was bad for them, right?
Right.
They were subject to racial violence because the white gangs there didn't want even a light presenting mixed race person in their mix. And so these were folks who were saying, my racial identity is multiracial, but put me with the black people. Like, don't put me here where I'm going to catch all kinds of grief, and my actual health and life are in danger by putting in me here with white people.
Right. That's really interesting, and it kind of reminds me of the last interview I did with Dr. Jack Manel, who is a professor at Winston-Salem State University. He's an Afro-Puerto Rican as well. He identifies as a Black Puerto Rican, and he was also incarcerated as a youth for 4 years in New York City, and it was interesting for him because, you know, I'm partially from New York City, and my experience was in the penal system. If you identified as so-called black, and if you identified as so-called Puerto Rican or other, you were separate, and you did not mix. A lot of times there was drama, but that wasn't his experience, and he was mainly, I think it was more about the borough you were from, and him being from Brooklyn, being part of a particular gang that was primarily black. He didn't have those experiences. So I'm fascinated by all of this, and I'm also fascinated, you know, by when did you come to the realization or the understanding of yourself as mixed race? Because I know a lot of other Afro Latinos who are like, yo, I was just raised to think I was Puerto Rican, or I was just raised to think I was Dominican. Not even necessarily having a concept of race in the way that non-Latinos have it. So when did you come to the realization that I'm a mixed race person?
Well, it's really interesting because I never really thought about myself as being mixed race. I always thought of myself as Afro-Latina. Right? Let me back up. So my parents are both from the Caribbean, but my father, white presenting, my mother, black presenting. Right? And even though, from the outside world, you would think, well, isn't it obvious that you're mixed race if you got these two different looking parents? I didn't really think much about his racial identity at all. I just associated myself with my mother. Maybe also because there were marital issues. Let's put it that way. And so I didn't identify with him at all. And it was only much later when, actually, I guess it was in the 90s when there was all of this sort of, the rise of a mixed race identity, and, should there be a separate box on the census, and also the kind of stuff that occurred to me. Oh, wait a minute. I guess this pertains to me as well. I never thought about it that way. Sort of like, one parent is one thing, one parent is another, and that means I'm mixed. I thought of myself as Afro-Latina. And within that Afro-Latina identity, there was always the notion of, well, all Latinos have some form of racial mixture because of our legacy of slavery, indigenous ancestry, European colonization. And so that's always part of the story of who we are in the Caribbean. But this multiracial label itself, I didn't really think about having associations with, only until there was sort of a lot more discourse about it in the public.
Okay. And you said that happened around like the 1990s.
Yes, that's when I started to sort of hear about this more. And I thought, well, I mean, I never thought of having a separate racial identity circled around racial mixture. Maybe because in my mind, the the language of racial mixture was always one that I associated with the Latino background. We talk about mestizo and mestizaje, so these ideas of racial mixture, and how different that was from the United States. Like, oh, in the Caribbean and Latin America, we're racially mixed, but in the United States, it's all these divisions, blah, 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 blah. So that was what I grew up with as what the stories of race and how the two things look different. And it's only when I start to hear other narratives in the US about the idea of multiracial identity that I start to say, wait a minute, is that how others might perceive me as well? That with respect to having a white presenting father and a black presenting mother.
So when you talk about multiracial identity, is that mutually exclusive from identifying, for example, as black? And the reason I ask that, and it's something we'll get into in a second, but I don't know if you heard, for example, Marcellus Wiley. He's a sports commentator and a former NFL athlete, and he was talking about Colin Kaepernick. And the whole thing was, he's not black, at least not black like Marcellus Wiley is. And he was talking about experiences, and it caused a big uproar. But the other thing I would say is that when people who are, I guess, black presenting, I'll just say I'm black, but when sometimes growing up like how I grew up, when I hear things like, multiracial identity and mixed race stuff, a lot of times, to be honest, I think a lot of us think, okay, you're going to be black when it's convenient. Then you're going to distance yourself from blackness when it benefits you, and then you're going to embrace it when it's cool. Whereas the rest of us don't have that opportunity. So anyway, I wanted to ask, are those things mutually exclusive? And what would you say to someone who said what I just said?
Well, it's interesting because there is this growing dynamic now of people who are saying that they are black multiracials. Right? So with that, my understanding is that they're trying to communicate that they have this more complex family life, right? Of a white presenting parent, a black presenting parent, to stick with a black white multiracial couple, that was their upbringing, but that they identify that their solidarity is with a blackness, right? And so it's acknowledging both things that are very real, right? And I think that there's something very honest about that, meaning it is not the same thing to be raised by two black presenting parents, right, who are not able to access any white privilege and on behalf of their child, right? And so if you are a black identified person, but you happen to have been raised in a household where there's a white presenting person and a black presenting person, that white presenting parent has been able to access some privileges, right, that other black children don't have. And so I think it's very honest for people to identify that way. Now, at the same time, I do concede that there's also this other dynamic, right, of folks who are strategic, right, about how they deploy and acknowledge their identity or identities. And so that the racial suspicion, let's put it that way, is not necessarily the figment of anyone's imagination, because there are people out there who tend to be very cunning and about how they position themselves, always for advantage. And so, I'm not trying to say that that's not real as well.
Right. So, what happened with Marcellus Wiley, for example, what happened essentially was, he was discussing Colin Kaepernick and talked about, him being raised by two white parents, essentially, and being mixed race, and saying that he didn't feel the full brunt of the things that he protests for. Like, he doesn't feel it the way that someone like Marcellus Wiley or someone like me would feel it.
Mm.
And he also, you know, Marcellus Wiley, who I thought was, I'll be honest, I thought was a little disingenuous,
Mm.
is, you know, Marcellus Wiley says, you know, I'm from Compton, California. You know, from age 0 to age 22, I was either in Compton or in Harlem.
Mm.
Where in Harlem he's from, I was like, so I looked it up. I was like, where in Harlem is he from? He went to Columbia, you know, so that's a little different. You know, his experience, and that's one of the things that I think there is a lot. There's so much blindness to our own privileges. And so I really respect what you said about the honesty of it. I'm not so sure. Do you think that everyone is using multiracial, you know, black presenting multiracial, or maybe I'm saying it wrong, what you said, but do you think that people are saying that because they are acknowledging the privilege of having a white parent, or do you think it's just acknowledging the parent, which I think are two different things?
Yeah, I think you're right. Those are two different things. Those are two different things, and it's certainly probably a range, right? But there's a variety, a variation in what it is that people are trying to communicate when they use those labels for themselves.
Right. So in the law, does Marcellus Wiley have a point? I know you said, you know, it's about, you know, that if you identify as black, however you identify isn't the issue. It's how you look. I don't know if this is beyond the scope of your research, but with someone like who presents like Colin Kaepernick and someone that presents like Marcellus Wiley, let's just say Marcellus Wiley looks like I do. Are there advantages to looking like Colin Kaepernick?
Well, two things I would separate out, right? When we talk about like the problem of racism, right? Two things. There's how does racism situate groups, right? So like, you know, how much socioeconomic status do people have as groups? Where are they segregated? Or these larger socioeconomic issues. And then there's how does law intervene into that?
Right.
So I think that there's two different, with those two different categories, there's two different things going on. So with the first, socioeconomic status, I do think there's a difference, right? And that's not just my own intuition, right? That's all the social science data that shows that we live not only in a racialized society, we live in one that is color struck, right? So that skin color, phenotype, hair texture, all of that matters, and all of that actually affects your wages, your opportunities, your promotions, and time and time again, social scientists are constantly documenting that, so that the lighter you are, the more favored you are within the labor market. It even pertains to immigrants. You would think, oh, are all immigrants, documented, undocumented, in the same boat? No. So the economists have studied this, and they're seen that there is a significant influence that skin tone has on immigrants of the same language background, same English language level of speaking, accent. Look, they control for all these other factors, and still skin tone they're doing it to work. Okay, there's that. But when you ask me, how does law intervene? Anyone who says they've been discriminated against, meaning denied a public good, not for any meritorious reason, but based because of their racial background, or what it's perceived to be, let's put it that way, right? Everybody's in the same boat then, with respect to how law intervenes. Law simply asks, what happened? And then two, was it based on a justifiable reason, or was it based because of race? So if Colin says, look, I applied for a job, poor guy, I applied for a job, I was qualified, they had openings, right? And they threw my resume in the trash can, right? He has a solid claim for discrimination, right? And they only looked at other white people. Right? That would be a claim for discrimination. A dark-skinned brother can come in, say the very same thing, and he would have a claim for discrimination, right? That is to say, it wasn't based on qualifications, and that people outside his racial group were being favored. Instead, there's a claim there. So you can have both an acknowledgement that skin color matters, but also at the same time acknowledge that racism and racial background, right, are also doing work, if you will, are also influencing how people are perceived and thus treated and mistreated in our society.
Right. Yeah. I think there was a study that I brought up, and I love the fact that we can have this really honest conversation about these issues. I think our society has been so severed and torn, particularly amongst Black people, broadly defined, particularly, diasporic, I would say. Not just when I say Black people, I'm not just talking like African Americans, but throughout the diaspora, we have been absolutely devastated by what white supremacy has done in terms of skin color. I've had a few conversations, and particularly, I think it's also gendered. I think,
Definitely.
in particular, had these conversations, and I can't talk colorism anymore. Like, I'll talk anything, literally anything, because I love to talk. I love dialogue. I love learning. I'm intellectually curious. I think anybody who's in the business that we are in is intellectually curious. But when you start talking colorism, everyone brings their personal experience and their personal pain, and you get nowhere. I brought up a study. There was a study at Villanova where they studied 12,000 cases of Black women in the criminal justice system. And they found that lighter-skinned Black women received lighter sentences by 12%. And served 11% shorter sentences. And I brought that up once on social media and got excoriated. It was like, you're a dark-skinned hater. It was crazy. Like, I was just like, holy moly. And so I just wanted to say how much I appreciate being able to have these kinds of discussions with somebody, and it not turn into something crazy. And I know this is probably something that is really difficult to ask a researcher. But, just from, I'm going to ask you to take your Dr. Hernandez hat off and be Tanya, Tanya from Queens, right?
From Manhattan, thank you very much.
Okay, from Manhattan. All right, my bad. And I want to ask you, how do you think we get past some of our issues as Black people, or as, Black, multiracial, however you identify, Black, multiracial? How do we get past some of these issues, and how do we get certain people, whether it's skin color or class, to understand their own privileges? I think we all understand privilege when it pertains to other people. We don't get it when we talk about ourselves. What do you think the steps we can take to do that, and how do you tell your children about their own privileges that they have, being the children of, a published author? And, again, let me just do a quick plug. Phenomenal. You should definitely go get it. But yeah, so how do you tell them about their own privilege so that they're not blind to it?
This is where I think that the work of Black feminists on intersectionality has been so powerful as a tool for all of us, right? So I say, diasporically, across genders and gender and sexualized identity. Because why? When you think about intersectionality, which is all about saying, the racism in our world, it's not uniformly experienced in the same way, right? That racism of that a black woman experiences is sexualized, right? There's a gender component that's different from how black men experience racism, right? And it's not that one is better than the other or one is worse than the other, right? But it's that if you want to be able to really be able to address it, you have to be able to actually be able to see it, right? So that when women talk about the racism they experience, there's a sexual harassment component, right? Because it's a racialized sexual harassment that's different from men. Doesn't mean that we don't care about black men, but it means that we have to see the truth of all the different angles in order to be able to properly sort of coalesce together to oppose it. So I think that the insights of Black feminists with intersectionality is sort of a way into trying to help all of us see our different privileges, right? Because the idea is this: if you first start from the starting point that all of us have intersectional identities and perspectives of all sorts, right? Then you're better able to see that within these intersections, different contexts and spaces and moments will elevate certain privileges over others. Right. So like there's one experience I relate to my students quite a bit when we're starting these kind of conversations in, for instance, the critical race theory class that I teach. And I talk about going to this like sort of elegant restaurant one time with a childhood friend who was white presenting and her mother. The mother had not really progressed much socioeconomically, right? So she was still looking like, from her more humble economic origins. But all right, so my girlfriend and her mother would go to this restaurant. And this is the first time I'd ever had this experience where the maitre d' comes up and says, looks at the mom and is like, I don't know about having this lady here. Like, you how much you can read in the server space. And then I say, I would very much appreciate if you could seat us. We do not have a reservation at this time, but we would like to have some refreshment. So meaning I put on all the Dr. Hernandez, right, for that maitre d'. And then it was a whole of the story and it was a whole of the treatment. And in that moment, I could see, yes, there's a way that skin color, surname, Hernandez, all of that can put me in a position where I'm racially positioned as not privileged. But in that moment, I was experiencing just how privileged I was, that my academic pedigree, my benefit in being able to articulate, right, in a particular register, all of that was benefiting me, right? And my clothing, etc. So that what space you're in, who else is in the room, all of these things are intersectional moments. And the more we're better able to start from that starting point. I'm probably, I think it took much longer to say this than you needed, but I guess because it's both a very personal thing and also part of what I view as sort of like my vocation and what I'm trying to do with my students and the public at large when I'm writing, to try to make the world a better place. And, it has to start from honesty. And part of the honesty is sort of seeing the ways in which there are benefits that you experience, even when you're in the midst of what others might view as a subordinated group.
Right. Absolutely. And so, one of the examples that I often talk about, and I think that frustrates me, and it's understandable because I have students who are the same way. And I'm sure I was to a degree at some point. But, I look at someone like, I really like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Oh.
But I think she doesn't see her own privileges. And it frustrates me, and I've talked about this actually in another podcast, but like, it frustrates me because, her parents, come from the Bronx, I think her dad, tested in and went to Stuyvesant or Bronx Science or somewhere like that, or Brooklyn Tech. And, I think and he became an architect and moved her out of the Bronx when she was like 5 years old. But she still claims the Bronx as if she grew up there and talks about the struggle and how she understands it. And I'm like, okay, you can understand it, but you didn't live it, and that's okay. And I don't think she ever acknowledges I didn't live it. I
Mm,
lived in Westchester in a place where people, the average, median household income was $1 million.
mm-hmm.
And that's okay. You can still advocate for those people. You didn't have to live. You don't. Your father worked really hard, so you didn't live his life. You
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean? And my mother is from Brownsville. You know what I'm saying? Brownsville, Brooklyn, between Brownsville and Bed-Stuy. I'm pretty sure she's from Marcy Projects. Um, and I've seen where she's grown up, where she grew up, and I see where even the fact that she took, me and my sister to Harlem was way better than where she grew up. And then my dad taking us out farther, first to Philadelphia and then to the suburbs in Maryland. Even when, her Alexandria Ocasio's whole thing is, well, I went and visited my family in the Bronx all the time. But it's like this privilege in being able to go home. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like I visited Harlem all the time in the crack era. You know what I'm saying? I'm
Mm-hmm.
28. I remember when people were getting shot up right on my grandmother's block. But when it got too hot, I could be like, all right, I'm jumping on the bus and I'm home. And there's privilege to that. And I just think that, I don't know, do you think it's generational? Or do you think that it's just something that we have in society where, because I think, I've seen how white people, I interacted with a lot of white people now, doing media, and they hate being told that they have privilege. Because I always thought it was because people think you're negating their hard work.
Mm.
But I realized black people and brown people hate it just as much, being told that they had privileges. Why do you think that is? Like, what is it that keeps us from acknowledging where we have these privileges?
It's interesting. I think one element is an authenticity politics that comes in, right? So this idea of, oh, I'm going to join the oppression Olympics and try to, my story is going to be worse than your story, and that's going to make me more authentic and let you know just how hard I had to fight to get to where I am, and so I earned it that much more. I earned it so much. And
Right.
and people acknowledging their privilege also means that when you acknowledge privilege, you acknowledge that you didn't get there alone, right? Or that you didn't get along just by your own Horatio Alger efforts and what have you, right? And I think that's part of it. But what I find frustrating about some of that is that my own experiences have often been that the very groups that I care about are so happy to have me say, I am Dr. Hernandez, right? Or that they are happy to say licenciada, which is lawyer, right? The honorific title for lawyer in Spanish. And so, and I love that too, about like I have a black, a Latina pastor, and she likes to have people call her by her first name, but I say, no, I say pastor. Pastor Karen. Why? Because I take such joy in being able to see a Latina from Brooklyn who is the head of her own church, taking care of business, trying to help people. And so I want to honor her with that title. And I don't feel like I need to have her like not acknowledge her title in order for it to feel like she's truly helping me or can understand me.
Right. Yes. No, I am someone who, you know, when it comes to men in the academy, my coworkers, you'll be Bob or Steve or Tim, but the women, for the most part, particularly if they're of a certain age, it's Dr. Harley, Dr. Hernandez, because I think that it's important to acknowledge, particularly women of color. It's important. A white woman could be married and still get the same respect. Uh, Tanya,
Well, but there's also the other side of it too, Jason, is that like my students, I can see that they get a rush out of saying Professor Hernandez. Like for them, it is a wonderful thing to be able to have someone who they kind of identify with, but can see in an elevated position. I don't have to pretend that there's not a hierarchy, right?
See,
That's
I've
more
had a
important.
different experience. I think that it's been a different experience for me.
Ah,
I think everybody, students, whether black or white, have wanted to think of me as their homeboy.
interesting.
Um, and
You
it
have youth on your side, my dear. I have a few more gray hairs.
well, we're probably close in age, to be honest, but um, yeah, I don't know. I do think that that helps because some of them identify
Mm.
closely with me, because they don't think of me as this kind of, you know, unreachable figure who's on this pedestal. But other times, I think that there can be a respect gap. So that's why, you know, I used to be like, oh, I don't care about these titles. Just call me Jason. And then I was like, nah, I can't do it. You know, and with women of color, I feel like, you know, again, it's funny because I was talking to some young activists who are a bunch of Latinas. Shout out to all the activists at the University of Maryland. They're all women of color. I don't know where the guys are. I don't know what's going on, but they're all women of color. But, you know, this young woman was like, she didn't like the fact that the black men called men and women of color kings and queens.
Huh.
And she was like, you know, it's it's so classist or something, or I don't know what the critique was, but I was like, well, you don't understand. And I think, and this is what I'm getting at with, you know, people liking to call you Dr. Hernandez. I wonder if it's an immigrant thing.
Oh.
Because for me, king and queen, you know why I will go up to a brother and say, peace, king, how you doing? Is because guess what? My grandfather got called. Boy. He was a boy. Didn't matter how old he was. He got called boy. So guess what? I'm gonna call you king. You know, I'm gonna give you that respect. You know, I'm gonna if you're a sister, when they will call you girl, you know, my grandmother got called girl. I'm gonna call you, you know, either queen if I don't know you, and if I know the title, I'm gonna call you Dr. Hernandez. You know, so that's the thing for me. So I wonder if it's an immigration thing. I'm gonna ask you to keep talking because I need to grab the charger because I thought I had enough power. So can you answer that for me? Do you think it's an immigrant thing or
Interesting. To use the honorifics. Well, you know, it's interesting. When I travel in Latin America, it's certainly the case that I do receive a lot more of the doctora, Dr. Hernandez treatment and an invitation because you know there's a lot more classism involved as well, and using the title is even that much more important because in Latin America and the Caribbean, the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, that is, they are not used to seeing women of color in spaces of elitism and of professional engagement. And so I think, you know, coming from that immigrant background, there certainly would be the case that the titles would be viewed as more important, and that the students of color who come from those spaces view them as important as well. So I think there's that angle to it to consider.
Yeah, I mean, when I think of, you know, some of the most beautiful sights that I've seen, first of all, I love graduation. It doesn't matter who's graduating. Sorry, I'm a little out of breath. I had to go grab the charger. But I love, you know, I don't care white, black, brown, but I do the black graduation and I do the Latino graduation at my university. And every year, I'm like, I don't know whether I want to smile or cry because I'm like so emotional because it's so powerful. And, you know, we've made it a family practice where I take my kids every year because I want them to see it, you know. and to see young people graduating and reaching that milestone. But I remember, kind of to your point about, the pride, I didn't see the pride from young people, but I remember when I got my doctorate and the old Black ladies coming up to me and, and they didn't know me, but they acted like I was their child or I was their grandchild, because there was so much pride in seeing a young Black man. I was young at the time. A young Black man accomplish that. And then, at the Latino graduation, every year, seeing all the abuelas, throughout the crowd, that's a powerful moment. And that's why, like I said, going back to that, I know a lot of, like I said, I'm from Spanish Harlem, so I know a lot of abuelas, but I had the privilege of leaving, let me be clear, but I know a lot of abuelas who were, washing floors, you know what I'm saying? And I know, my grandmother was plunging toilets, so like, for me, that's why when I call you Dr. Hernandez, I sometimes call you Tanya because my sister's name is Tanya, so it's kind of sticks. But for the most part, I'll call you Dr. Hernandez because I think about those abuelas in Harlem that I knew that got up early in the morning to go to the bus stop or get on the train. You know what I mean? And I think about my grandmother who was plunging toilets and doing odd jobs just to make ends meet and raise 3 kids by herself. So for me, that's where it comes to. And I wish that somebody, with all the times that those women were called, well, I can't speak to the abuelas, but I can definitely speak to the Black women being called girl. You know what I mean? That somebody did say, call them queen. You know what I mean? And some of them probably never got that in their entire lifetime. So for me, and not only that, but you earn the title doctor. You know what I mean? You earn the title Esquire. Those are titles that you earn. So, why wouldn't I use them? I don't know. I think it's cool that your students have so much pride. Are your students primarily, would you say that they are Black? Or
Well, law school is a more elite sphere, right? So I'll just put that out there. I mean, graduate school is already very elite, and then the professional graduate schools even more so, right? So there's a sorting process that happens. That's a whole other podcast conversation that we could be having, right? So there's that. But because there are smaller numbers of students of color than you would see like in an undergraduate level of learning, the students of color who are progressive and are very concerned with social justice issues, they are a particularly tight community. Right? And I tend to see them because they will come to me in upper level classes for anti-discrimination law, for employment discrimination, for critical race theory, for the implicit bias, trainings that I do. And they identify as African American. I have quite a few students who are children of African immigrants, West Indian immigrants, Latino immigrants. And so, there's a great variation there within that population of color, along with Southeast Asian, right? And then I got my woke white people too. I mean, it's so funny you're talking about graduation. Just this past May was really a special graduation for me because the students voted me Professor of the Year. So that meant I got to be at the graduation on the podium for the entire time, giving a little speech. And it was such a joy to see all those parents in that room and to greet them in Spanish, in French, in Yoruba. I mean, I had a good time with it.
That's amazing. Do you think that as a multiracial woman, do you think that it sounds like you have, even though it is an elite sphere, do you think that it's been easier for you to relate and gain the trust of your students, being that, you know, sort of you've got the Barack Obama syndrome where everyone can identify with you somehow. Like perhaps the white students are like, she's white enough.
Hmm.
The black students are like, she's black enough. They're not.
Interesting. Interesting. That wasn't my, or at least that wasn't my perception,
Uh-huh.
as a new law professor, right? When I entered law teaching, this is now almost 25 years ago, so it was quite a while. What my experience was is that the students saw Hernandez on the board, right, or on the syllabus, and that they reacted a lot to that. And then I walk in the room and they see a brown skin Hernandez, and they reacted quite a bit to that, and that there wasn't. I mean, to the extent that that mattered to students in a negative way, it wasn't mediated by any thoughts about, well, she's sort of light, so maybe the father or the mother is light skinned, or like there wasn't when they were giving me a racialized treatment, sort of like attacks in the classroom because they are presuming that I don't know what I'm talking about, and so they're like double checking me and trying to haze me. Those early years of being a newbie law professor, I didn't feel like it was getting soft and softened up, right? Because I was lighter skinned, or they thought my hair didn't look, whatever, the good hair, bad hair, ridiculous, mythologies of hair texture. But that being said, I would be disingenuous if I didn't admit to you that there has long been this understanding that many of the law professors in teaching, right, Black identified, not having any multiracial, notions of themselves, but the law professorate is primarily light skinned, right? That there is some kind of weird talented 10th thing going on, or that the labor market still is responding, even if it's unconscious, to pigment.
Wow.
So if you look at the array of law professors, especially from like a generation back, they are primarily light skinned.
Really?
Yes, I
Wow.
mean, there's some dark skinned people thrown in there. There's always a little bit of a,
Yeah.
some, what do they call it? The outlier, right? There's always an outlier, in every group. But you line everybody up, and there's lots of light skin going on.
That's really interesting. I
Mhm.
I had no idea. Obviously, well, in my discipline, it's not necessarily like that.
Mhm.
There's dark skinned people, there's light skinned people. Um, Offline, we'll talk a little more about color politics. But I still want to keep my job, so I'm not going to say too much. But there's some stories I could tell you. But definitely, I had never heard that about law professors. And so it's kind of like, it's still like 1900 or something.
It's crazy. Yeah, the person who first pointed it out to you, how it is, like you're living it, so you're not thinking about it, but then
Yeah.
somebody points it out, and then you can never unsee it. It was a professor actually at University of Maryland Law School, Professor Tanya Lavelle Banks.
Okay.
She's been teaching longer than me. She's like one of my mentors. And we were, having coffee one day, and she like pointed it out to me. Exactly. You'll see her in the back script of the book.
I knew I remembered that name. Right.
That's right. So, one of the wise elder statesmen, she pointed that out to me once. And then, of course, I was like looking for it every time, I'm at a law conference. And I was like, she is right.
Wow. That is deep. And I'm thinking about, I don't know about law professors, but I'm thinking about the people that I know that either practice law or, have law degrees, which is a lot of people get law degrees. I've noticed. It's a versatile degree.
Exactly.
It's a very versatile degree. There was a point where I was like, I should have gotten a law degree. Then, I knew a couple of people who were reading contracts for $30 an hour, and I was like, yeah, maybe I made the right decision. I don't know if I could have produced, this book here, which again, if you're watching, excellent book. You should buy it. It's wonderful. And Dr. Hernandez, I think I deserve about 2% on each book sale because I've promoted your book several times, actually. Because
Thank you, my brother.
No doubt, no doubt, no doubt. Thank you, my light-skinned sister, my light-skinned queen. But yeah, so I'm not going to take up too much of your time. I know we're at a little past what I told you I was going to take up, but I definitely thank you for giving us your perspective. And now I'm going to be looking at every law professor in the world that I can find and do my own survey, informal survey. But thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Hernandez, and I really appreciate it. Is there anything you want to leave our audience with?
Well, I guess what the main thing that I would want to say is that my hope in writing the book was that what people would be able to see is that while personal identity is obviously, it's important, right? How each individual sort of views themselves and sort of navigates the world, that discrimination is something that is not so subtle, it is not so nuanced, and that we need not sort of to believe the hype that just because we identify in a more fluid way, that means it changes how the world operates. There's a sort of this mythology that being racially mixed means that, and the growth of more racial mixture is going to somehow solve all our problems. And I'm sorry, discrimination is not one of these nuanced kind of phenomena. It's crude, it's nasty. That's what it's designed to do. And
Right.
we need to not mix these two things together. We need to have
Right.
clarity in order to be able to have a proper response to it, and an effective response. And dreaming away and hoping that us being racially mixed or having more interracial relationships is going to somehow erase, 400 years of the legacy of slavery, that is not the way forward.
Definitely. Well, I can tell you, certainly anyone who thinks that, and I've heard people say that, well, this is the browning of America. We're going to all be mixed in 100 years. I can tell you that we need only look to the South and look in Latin America, where, people have a whole lot of mixing going on. But when you look at the favelas or the barrios or whatever, a lot of times, or the rural places in Central America, a lot of them are either indigenous or are Black, the poorest places, and the places with the fewest resources. So this idea that we're going to get rid of racism that way, and by the way, I know people who are in interracial relationships and the person they're in a relationship with is racist. That happens as well. But thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for keeping it real. And thank you for coming on tour with us.
My pleasure. Anytime.
All right. Thanks.